The wind keened across the high ridges, a sound that carried more sorrow than rage. Snow spiraled down from the heavens in thick veils, burying pine and stone alike beneath its weight. The mountain did not welcome travelers in winter. It buried them, silenced them, made their bones part of the earth. Through that storm stumbled Clara Whitfield. Her skirts were soaked, stiff with ice, her hands raw and swollen where the cold had chewed through her gloves. She leaned on a broken branch for balance, her boots sinking deep with every step. The snow came to her knees, and still she pressed forward because stopping meant death. Her breath tore in shallow bursts, each one burning her lungs. Hunger gnawed at her belly. She had eaten nothing since yesterday's crust of bread, but her mind was sharper than her body's weakness. Driven by the image of a faint light she thought she'd seen high on the ridge. A light meant fire. Fire meant life. Behind her lay the town that had cast her out. She could still hear their words, carried on the wind like curses. Whore. Savage's wife. Let her rot. The preacher's sermon had been the final blow, standing before his flock, declaring Clara damned for wedding a man of Comanche blood. When her husband died, they said it was God's judgment. When she refused to crawl back into their mercy, they turned their backs and spat on her door. She had left with nothing but her shawl, her grief, and her pride. Now the storm tested whether pride could outlast the mountain's fury. Her vision wavered. The white blur of snow folded around her until she could not tell sky from ground. Her knees buckled, sinking her down into the drift. For a moment she almost welcomed it. To sleep here, to let the snow cover her, would be easy, peaceful. Then, through half-frozen lashes, she saw it again. A flicker of orange, faint but steady, bleeding through the storm. Smoke twisted upward from a dark shape on the ridge. A cabin. Clara forced her legs to move. Each step was agony, her skirts dragging like chains. The light grew brighter, steadying her heartbeat. When at last she reached the cabin's door, she beat against it with what little strength remained. At first there was no answer. The storm roared, rattling the logs. Her hands fell weakly and she sagged against the frame. Then with a heavy groan the latch lifted. The door swung open. A man filled the threshold, broad-shouldered, framed by the glow of firelight behind him. His hair was dark, touched by gray, his beard thick, his eyes wary. He looked like a figure carved from the mountain itself, every line hardened by solitude. Clara tried to speak, but only a broken whisper came. "Please." She collapsed forward, half into his arms, half onto the floor. The snow followed her in, curling across the rough-hewn boards. Elias Cutter cursed under his breath. He had not seen another soul in weeks and had not wanted to. He had come here to be left alone, far from the world that had bled him dry in the war. Yet here she was, shivering and broken on his floor, dragging the world back into his cabin with her. For a moment he thought of shutting the door and letting the storm take her. That would be cleaner, easier. She was nothing to him. But something in her face, and pale, fierce even in ruin, stayed his hand. He bent down, lifted her with arms that had carried dead men from battlefields, and set her near the fire. The flames licked her frozen skirts, thawing the edges of cloth and skin. She shuddered, breath rattling in her chest. Elias threw a blanket across her shoulders and crouched close enough for her to hear his voice. His words came rough, half command, half mercy. "Stay with me, or freeze out there." The wind howled against the shutters, snow hissing at the door. Inside, the fire crackled. And for the first time in months, Elias Cutter was not alone. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, timbers moaning as if the mountain itself pressed down upon it. The fire spat resin from a pine log, filling the room with the sharp tang of smoke. On the floor, wrapped in a wool blanket, Clara Whitfield stirred. Her lips were cracked, her lashes crusted white with frost. She blinked against the blaze, uncertain whether she had survived or stumbled into some dream. Across the room sat Elias Cutter. His knife scraped slow against the whetstone, the rhythm steady, deliberate like the ticking of some unseen clock. His eyes, gray as the sky before snowfall, watched her without warmth. Clara shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her body ached as if she'd been beaten. She found her voice brittle and small. "You might have left me to die." Elias did not look away from his blade. "I thought about it." Her heart thudded. The honesty in his tone carried no cruelty, only fact. She studied him more closely. A man carved from long winters, scars like pale rope across his hands, his beard streaked with gray. A man who had chosen exile as others chose salvation. Then why didn't you? She asked. The knife paused mid-stroke. He set it down, the steel flashing in the firelight, then leaned back in his chair. Because I've buried enough. The words hung in the smoke-thick air. The next days passed in uneasy silence. Clara mended her skirts with clumsy stitches, refusing to sit idle. She swept the floor, gathered kindling from just beyond the door, and cooked what little she could from his supplies. Elias watched but said little, as though every word were a coin too precious to spend. At night, when the wind screamed like a dying animal across the ridge, Clara lay awake beneath the blanket and listened to his footsteps pacing the floor. She caught the sound of his breath, shallow, restless, like a man locked in battle with memories he could not silence. Her own memories stalked her too. Faces of the women in town, lips curled with disgust, the preacher's voice condemning her from the pulpit for marrying a man who was half Comanche. The day her husband's body was brought back, torn by gunfire, left unburied in the sun. Their words afterward, venom disguised as scripture. It was bound to happen. A woman who forgets her place earns her punishment. She pressed her fists into the blanket until her nails cut her palms. Alone in the dark, she swore she would never crawl back to them, even if the storm claimed her first. By the third night, the silence cracked. Clara dropped a pot on the stone hearth, the clang sharp. Elias turned, eyes narrowed. "You stalk about like a ghost," she said, her voice tight with fatigue. "If you mean for me to feel unwelcome, you've succeeded." He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, his gaze heavy. "You want hospitality? You picked the wrong ridge." Her chin lifted, fire answering fire. "I didn't pick any ridge. The storm drove me here, and I've earned my place by working. Or would you rather I lie in the snow and die so you can keep your silence unbroken?" For the first time, his expression shifted, not softened, but fractured. A shadow crossed his eyes, something that looked like guilt. "I've watched enough die," he muttered. Clara's voice cut through. "Then stop treating me like one of them." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elias turned away, retreating to his chair. He reached for the knife again, but his hand lingered in the air, uncertain. That night, as the wind battered the shutters, Elias sat alone, staring into the fire. The glow painted his face in harsh relief, the scar along his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. Memories pressed hard. The war's smoke, his father's burned farmstead in Tennessee, the cries of men dying in mud he could not lift from. He had buried too many, yes, comrades, kin, strangers. The smell of ash clung to him still. Behind him, Clara shifted in her blanket, watching. She saw not just a hermit hardened by solitude, but a man weighed down by ghosts. For the first time, her resentment eased. "Who were they?" she asked softly. He turned, startled. "The ones you buried." His jaw tightened. For a long time he said nothing. Then, in a voice scarcely louder than the fire's hiss, "Too many to name." Clara held his gaze, steady and unflinching. She did not press further. The silence that followed was not the cold emptiness of before, but something fragile, waiting. The storm raged on, yet inside the cabin something shifted. Suspicion gave way to recognition. Not of friendship, not yet, but of kinship in exile. She cast out by the righteous. He abandoned by a country that had no use for its broken men. The cabin walls pressed close, the wind shrieked, and still they endured. Two strangers bound by firelight and pride, learning slowly, unwillingly, that survival was not only of the body, but of the heart. The cabin's single window glowed faintly, a fragile square of warmth against the endless white of the mountain night. Inside, the fire cracked, sending up sparks that danced and died before they reached the smoke-darkened rafters. Clara sat near the flames, her hands red from the cold yet steady as she stitched a tear in her dress with thread Elias had left on the table. Silence filled the cabin again. Elias leaned over a wooden block, sharpening his knife with long, even strokes. The sound carried, filling the air like a second heartbeat. He hadn't spoken much in 2 days, only enough to tell Clara where the water was stored, or to toss a piece of venison her way. She hadn't pressed him. Not yet, but things were changing between them, as surely as snow gave way to meltwater in spring. During the day, Clara gathered fallen branches from the trees just beyond the cabin, dragging them back in bundles tied with her shawl. The work chafed her skin and stiffened her hands, but it kept her alive. Elias hunted in silence, moving like a ghost through the pines. Sometimes he returned with a rabbit slung over his belt, other times with nothing but frost on his beard. At night, they shared the fire. Clara would speak first. A word here, a question there. "You live alone up here?" she asked one evening, laying her mended dress across the chair to dry. Elias's jaw shifted, but his eyes stayed on the fire. "I've had enough of towns. Enough of men with laws in their pockets and guns at their hips." She waited. "The war?" His gaze flicked to her, sharp as a blade. Then it softened, just barely. "The war." She didn't ask more. Not that night. The next evening, Clara told him about the town she left behind, or rather the town that drove her out. She spoke in a low voice, as though the snow outside could carry her words back to the people who had once spat at her feet. "I thought I could change them," she said, staring into the firelight. "I thought if they saw the way I loved him, they'd see him as more than Comanche blood. But they never forgave me for it. Not when he was alive, not when he died." Elias's knife stopped its steady rhythm. He set it down slowly. "They don't forgive easy," he muttered. "Not what they don't understand." Clara's lips trembled, but she pressed them tight, refusing tears. She wasn't here to be pitied. That night, when they both lay on opposite sides of the hearth, wrapped in separate blankets, Elias rolled once onto his side, looking across the shadows at her sleeping form. He told himself it was only to make sure she was still breathing. Only that. The days lengthened. The snow outside began to crust and sparkle under the weak sun, though it was far from gone. Clara's strength returned slowly, her cheeks flushed with color again, her walk steadier. She moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, cooking what little they had, mending what she could, filling the silence with the scrape of needle on fabric or the soft hum of an old hymn. Elias felt the change in himself, too, a weight he hadn't noticed lifting, if only a fraction. He'd spent years alone, speaking only to the trees or the wind. Now words lingered on his tongue, wanting release. One night, as the fire burned low, their hands brushed when she passed him a wooden bowl. Neither pulled away fast enough. The touch was brief, but it lingered like a brand. Clara lowered her eyes. Elias cleared his throat, muttered something about the weather, but both of them lay awake longer that night, staring into the dark. The bond grew, unspoken but undeniable. Yet Elias began to retreat, pulling into himself when her eyes lingered too long, when her voice reached too deep. He told himself it was wrong. She was a widow, broken by cruelty, clinging to survival. And he was nothing but a scarred man hiding from the world, hardly fit to save her. One evening after supper, Clara set her sewing aside and fixed him with a steady look. The firelight carved sharp lines on her face, fierce and beautiful. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" she asked. Elias's chest tightened. He gripped his cup hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Because what you want from me, I never said I wanted anything." Her voice cut clean, but it trembled at the edges. He looked at her then, really looked. The strength in her jaw, the sorrow in her eyes, the courage it took for her to ask. "You deserve more than a man who can't forget the smell of burning fields," he said at last. Clara stood, moved closer, the fire behind her like a halo of flame. "And you think I don't carry ghosts? You think I don't wake up hearing the things they called me? I don't want more, Elias. I want real, even if it's broken." The silence between them grew heavy. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin walls. Elias rose slowly to his feet. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand rest lightly against her arm. She didn't flinch. It wasn't a kiss, not yet. Just the promise of something forbidden, fragile, and necessary. That night they shared a single blanket against the cold. Neither spoke of what it meant. Neither dared, but the fire between them no longer belonged to the hearth. The crack of hooves broke the stillness of the mountain morning. Snow shifted from the pine branches, tumbling down like shaken feathers. Elias's hand froze where it gripped the axe handle. He didn't need to see the riders yet. He felt them, a disturbance rolling up from the valley like a storm that had finally found his ridge. Elias wiped the axe blade on his trousers, his jaw working tight. Behind him, the cabin door creaked as Clara stepped out, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She saw the line of riders snaking up the trail, dark shapes against white snow, rifles slung, voices carrying on the brittle air. Her breath caught, but she did not retreat. The men arrived in a cloud of frost and contempt. There were 5 of them, wrapped in dusters and wool, their eyes sharp with judgment. At the front rode Sheriff Danner, a narrow-eyed man with a voice like gravel. His gaze settled on Clara first, then Elias. "Well, I'll be damned," Danner spat into the snow. "We thought the coyote ran into the hills. Didn't reckon she'd find herself a den." The others laughed, low and cruel. Clara's chin lifted. She said nothing. Elias stepped forward, the axe resting against his shoulder like a warning. "You rode all this way. What for?" Danner leaned on his saddle horn. "She's wanted back in the valley. Stole from the mercantile, turned her back on God and decent folks. Ain't fit to be walking free, not after laying with a savage." His words dripped poison. "You harbor her, Cutter. You make yourself an enemy of the law." Elias's scars seemed to tighten on his face. His silence weighed heavier than any shouted curse. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped. Forgotten. Clara stood by the doorframe, her hands curled tight into fists. She'd expected this. She'd feared it in every shadow of the woods, every shift in the wind. And yet, when it came, her fear was not the only thing inside her. There was also defiance. She stepped past Elias onto the snow-packed ground, her boots sinking deep. The men's eyes tracked her, hungry for weakness. "You can spread your lies," Clara said, her voice trembling but strong. "But you will not drag me back to kneel at your feet. I buried my husband in that valley. I buried the last of my forgiveness with him." The laughter faltered. Danner scowled. "You dare!" Elias moved then, stepping to her side, the axe still in hand. "She stays," he said, low but steady. "You want her, you'll walk over me first." The words hung in the frozen air, heavier than gunmetal. The men shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected resistance, not from Clara, not from the hermit mountain man. "You'd risk your neck for her?" Danner sneered. "For a woman who don't belong nowhere? You don't even know her kind of trouble." Elias's eyes burned with something more than anger, something Clara had only glimpsed in fleeting moments by the fire. "I know enough." He turned then, just enough to look at her, and for the first time the truth lay bare between them. He was choosing her. Not as a burden, not as a stray. As something worth standing for. Clara felt her chest tighten, a tremor of fear and desire colliding. This man, scarred by war and solitude, was binding his fate to hers. She had thought herself ruined, unwanted, unworthy. But in that moment, with rifles aimed and snow crunching under boots, she felt her strength rise like flame from cold ashes. One of the riders spat into the snow. "To hell with this." He tugged at his reins, but Danner raised a hand. "You think you can hole up here, Cutter? Winter won't last forever. Come spring, we'll come back. We'll bring more men, more fire." Elias shifted the axe in his grip. "Come when you like. The mountain takes its due from everyone." Danner's glare lingered on Clara, as though branding her with it. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Then he turned his horse, and the riders wheeled back down the ridge, their curses trailing in the icy wind. Silence fell heavy. Clara's breath misted in the air. Her body shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what had just passed. Elias let the axe fall into the snow, his hand flexing as though he'd gripped it too long. His eyes met hers. "You didn't hide," he said. It wasn't a question. "I won't," Clara answered. "Not ever again." They stood there, two exiles against the world, the snow swirling around them like ghosts. And in that stillness, something broke open inside both of them. Clara reached for him first, her hand brushing his arm, steadying herself as much as him. Elias didn't pull away this time. Instead, he turned fully to her, the fire of his choice still burning in his gaze. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was a vow, spoken without words. Whatever shadows came from the valley, they would face them together. That night, the fire in the cabin burned brighter than it had before. Elias sat near it, sharpening his rifle instead of the knife. Clara sat close, her shoulder brushing his. She could feel the warmth of him, not just from the fire but from the decision he had made on that ridge. Outside, the mountain kept its silence, But inside, the firelight flickered with new promise. Danger sharpened into desire, fear tempered into strength, too, and both of them knew the valley would return. But so would their defiance. The first crack of a rifle shattered the dawn. It echoed off the ridge, scattering crows from the black trees. The snow was pink with early light, and the silence of the mountain broke into chaos. Elias Cutter dropped low, pulling Clara with him behind the cabin's rough-hewn wall. Splinters burst from the wood where another shot struck, lodging into his coat. His chest heaved, his hand already on the rifle he'd kept within reach since the rider's visit. "They've come early," he muttered, eyes narrowing. Clara's breath clouded in the freezing air. She gripped the old shotgun Elias had pressed into her hands 2 nights ago. It was heavy, cold, but alive with purpose. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She had known this moment would come. The valley did not forgive. The riders circled the cabin like wolves, their shouts carrying through the pines. Sheriff Danner's voice cut above the rest. "Send her out, Cutter. She don't belong in these hills. Hand her over and we'll leave you breathing." Elias's jaw clenched. He glanced at Clara, and in that fleeting look there was no command, no expectation, only recognition. She was not baggage to be bargained. She was the choice he had already made. "Stay low," he told her. Then he moved like the soldier he had once been, slipping around the window, steadying his rifle and firing. The crack roared, and one of the riders toppled into the snow. The fight had begun. Gunfire answered in a thunderous volley. Bullets chewed into the logs, shattering clay chinking, sending smoke and snow into the air. Clara pressed her back against the wall, the shotgun cold in her grip. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling with a fear that tasted like iron. Through the window's jagged edge, she saw a figure moving toward the cabin, revolver drawn. Without thinking, she raised the shotgun, her arms heavy with recoil before she even pulled the trigger. The blast thundered, deafening in the small space. The man crumpled, snow swallowing him. Clara lowered the weapon, her body shaking violently. Her vision blurred as though she'd torn something loose inside herself. She had taken a life. The knowledge pressed down on her chest, but when she met Elias's eyes across the cabin, she saw not judgment but fierce, steady fire. "You did what you had to," he told her. The fight raged. Elias slipped from cover to cover, his rifle cracking, each shot controlled and deliberate. He moved with scars in his memory, fields burned, comrades fallen, but also with a clarity he had not known in years. Then the cry came. Clara turned in time to see a rider breaking from the trees, charging close, revolver aimed at Elias's back. "Elias!" she screamed. He spun too late. The gun fired. Elias staggered, crimson blooming against the snow at his side. The world slowed, the mountain itself seeming to hold its breath. Clara did not think. She surged forward, raising the shotgun again. The second blast tore through the morning, and the rider pitched from his horse, blood mingling with snow. Elias dropped to his knees, hand pressed to his wound. Clara fell beside him, fumbling with shaking hands, pressing cloth from her shawl against the bleeding. Her eyes brimmed with panic, with fury. "You don't leave me," she whispered fiercely. "Not after all this. Not after choosing me." His face was pale, his breath ragged clouds, and yet even there, in the raw pain of it, his eyes softened. "I was afraid," he said, voice rough, almost lost under the gunfire, not of dying. "I've been ready for that since the war. Afraid of losing you. You made me human again, Clara. Don't let me fall back into the dark." Her tears froze on her cheeks. She pressed harder against the wound. "Then you fight, Elias Cutter. You fight with me." Bullets cracked overhead, horses screamed, the valley men regrouping. But Clara and Elias leaned together in the bloodied snow. 2 broken exiles who had found in each other something worth more than breath itself. Clara rose, her shawl now bound tight against Elias's side, the shotgun reloaded in her hands. She stood at the cabin door, shoulders squared. The woman the valley had cast out was gone. What remained was a survivor, forged in fire and loss, unwilling to bow again. She fired into the trees, her voice ringing out like thunder. "You'll not take him. You'll not take me." The mountain echoed her defiance. When the last echoes of gunfire faded, when the last rider fled, limping into the valley shadows, silence fell heavy again. Snow drifted softly through broken branches, covering the dead like a shroud. Clara dropped the shotgun, stumbling back to Elias. He was weak but alive, his hand finding hers, gripping with what strength he had left. They sat together in the blood-stained snow, the cabin smoking behind them, the mountain holding witness. The cost had been terrible, and yet life remained. The fire between them, tested in violence, refused to die. Clara leaned her forehead against his. "You still have me, and I'll never leave." Elias closed his eyes, holding her hand tight, the snow red around them. "Then I can live." The dawn broke fully then, the sun rising over the ridge, painting the snowfields gold and crimson. A battlefield, a graveyard, and a beginning. The mountain, once silent and indifferent, now carried their story in its frozen breath. Two souls who chose each other against a world that would see them buried. The cabin smelled of blood, smoke, and pine resin. Elias lay half-conscious on the cot, his shirt cut open, wounds raw and crimson where bullets had grazed him. Clara's hands, trembling yet unyielding, pressed linen against his side. Each breath he drew was ragged, a fight against the cold that still clung to the mountain. Snow still blanketed the ground outside, though the first fingers of spring sunlight broke through the branches overhead. Water dripped from icicles at the eaves, their steady rhythm like a clock marking the fragile line between death and survival. Elias stirred, his lips cracked, voice hoarse. "You should have run when they came." Clara shook her head, brushing soot from her face with the back of her sleeve. Her eyes, swollen with sleeplessness, burned with a strange brightness. "I've been running all my life, Elias. From whispers, from shame, from men who thought they could decide what I was worth. Not anymore." Her hand stilled on the bandage. For a moment she looked at him not as the mountain man who had pulled her from the snow weeks ago, but as the broken, guilt-worn soul who had chosen exile rather than face the world. The fire cracked low, shadows shifted across the log walls. Outside, the silence after violence was thick, broken only by the faint cry of a crow circling overhead. Elias turned his face toward her. Pain deepened the lines at his mouth, but there was something else too. Fear, almost tender in its nakedness. "I thought I'd lost you out there," he whispered. "And losing you, it made me realize how long it's been since I let myself care if someone stayed or went." Clara leaned close, her fingers tightening around his. His blood still stained her palms, but she didn't flinch from the sight of it. "You're not losing me," she said. "Not now. Not ever." By the time the thaw came, the valley had begun to soften. Snow receded from the pines, revealing dark earth and the faint green of early shoots. The river, once bound in ice, moved again with a restless current. Clara carried buckets to the stream while Elias, pale but healing, watched from the cabin's doorway. The world was shifting, and with it so were they. He limped to her side, his breath shallow but steady. For the first time since the bloodshed, the air felt clear enough to speak of choices. "You know what it means if we leave this mountain," he said, his voice low. "They'll call you names worse than they already have. They'll call me worse. We won't be welcomed." Clara set the bucket down, water sloshing against the rim, her gaze lifted toward the ridges above them, where sunlight spilled like gold over snowcaps. "Then let them," she said. "I didn't come this far to beg for their mercy. I choose this life. I choose you, not because you saved me, but because you see me as I am." The words seemed to shake something loose inside Elias. All those years of silence, of guilt and self-banishment, had been a kind of death. Now, hearing her speak, it was as if breath had returned to his lungs. He took her hand. Rough, scarred fingers closed over hers, and for once, he didn't hide the tremor in his grip. That night, they burned the last of the raiders' belongings in a pit behind the cabin. Boots, torn coats, the shattered fragments of rifles. The fire roared high, sparks riding the wind into the starlit dark. Clara and Elias stood side by side, the glow painting their faces in shifting light. Smoke rose behind them, curling into the black sky like a final marker of the life they had buried. When the flames sank low, Elias looked at Clara. She wasn't the frightened woman he'd found half dead in the snow. She was different now, harder, braver, her dignity reborn in fire. "You could walk away," he said quietly, as though testing her resolve one last time. Clara's answer was simple. She slipped her hand into his. "No, I'm walking with you." At dawn, they left the cabin behind. Elias's arm rested across her shoulders, her hand steady at his side. They climbed the higher ridge together, boots crunching through the softening snow. Behind them, smoke drifted upward, a thin gray column against the morning sky. the last remnant of the fire, the grave marker of everything they had endured. Ahead, the ridge opened to a view of endless peaks, wild and unbroken, touched with the pale light of spring. Clara and Elias walked on, two shadows cast long across the snow, hand in hand, no longer prisoner to the past. Their silence was not empty. It was the silence of choosing, the silence of survival, the silence of love forged in ash and blood. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from.